Hi, welcome back. Today what I want to do is take you through the history of actor training. The training of actors actually has not been going on for very long when we look at world history. If we go back to the ancient Greeks, the time of Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides, they did not train actors. Basically, a playwright would get their friends to come and be in a play. Now, we do have classes in period acting styles where actors will go back and try to look at how an actor would have performed in that day and time. Now, we know the ancient Greeks wore giant masks. And these masks represented the characters that they were playing. They wore long robes. They wore shoes that were made of cork, that were actually elevated. And the idea being that most of their characters were their heroes or their gods, and therefore they were bigger than life. Also, because they performed outdoors in amphitheaters to several thousand people, they needed to look large. Now, on top of the mask, there was a big headpiece as well. So they looked very tall when they were out on stage. We know that their movement was slow and majestic. It had to be. If you're wearing a giant mask and you're on cork high heels, it's a little hard to move, especially quickly. So they moved slowly. They used giant gestures. And they talked very loud and very clear. We know that in the beginning, they used only one actor and a chorus. Under Sophocles, they would use two actors and the chorus. And then Euripides really changed things when he introduced the third actor and the chorus. So if you go back to the earliest Greek plays, there are a lot of monologues, not much dialogue. Basically, a character could walk out, the same actor would walk out, do a monologue, leave the stage, put on a different mask, and then come out as a different character. We know that that's pretty much what they did. And as I said, there was no training for this. It was usually the playwright and a few of his friends, and they would come out and perform. As time went by, we still don't have any acting schools. By the Elizabethan period, actors were learning to act by being apprentices. What would happen is you would say, what if the King's Men, you wanted to join the theater company, the King's Men in England, you would go visit them, ask to be signed on as an apprentice, and if they liked you, you would do that. As an apprentice, you probably wouldn't be paid, or you'd be paid very little, and you would do all the work. I mean, you would do lots of work. And then when they performed, you would be the minor characters, the guy with the shield standing in the back, and pretty much learn to act by looking at the rear end of the leading actors. And eventually, if you stayed with it long enough, you could work your way up until you could become a leading actor. When we get to 1660, there's a major change in theater. In 1660 in England, we have the restoration of the monarchy. Charles I had been dethroned and he was killed. We have the Puritans pretty much running the country, and when they took over, they closed the theaters. They didn't allow dancing. They outlawed Christmas. I mean, there were a lot of things that people could not do. England was not a very fun place. And then in 1660, the king comes back, and it's Charles II, the son of Charles I. And when Charles II is crowned king, everything changes. He brings back all the fun stuff. Now they can sing, they have Christmas again, they have parties, and theater returns. And he does something else that totally revolutionizes theater. He makes it legal for women to act on stage. This had not happened before this. So when you saw a play in Shakespeare's time, all the women were played by men. In 1660, with the Restoration, now you have women playing women's roles, and that allows plays to get more sexual and more believable. Now, some people will talk, say, well, you know, why would Charles do that? I mean, what made him want to change theater? Well, Charles was married, but he had several mistresses, and his favorite mistress was a lady named Nell Gwynn. And Nell Gwynn wanted to be an actress. And Charles wanted to please Nell Gwynn, so Nell Gwynn would please Charles. So, okay, women can now act on stage. And that, again, totally revolutionized theater. Now, in the Restoration period, comedies were very popular. We know that there was a lot of innovation. They were making fun in these comedies of the very wealthy. And so a lot of the things in the plays actually would have taken place in real homes. One of the things that was done in that period, and I'm going to demonstrate this for you, actors wore lots of lace in that time period. It was important that the wealthy look clean. And so they wore white lace, and they wore lots of it. It was a symbol of their wealth. But it was so much lace they couldn't put their hands down, or their hands would be covered by the lace. So men would stand with their hands thusly. And the idea being that it would keep the lace there without it covering their hands. They wore lots of plumage, lots of things on their hats, ribbons. They had long hair, and the men would flip their hair. So if you're studying period acting styles, you have to learn this. And one of the things I find very funny in this period is the man would do what was called making a leg. And I have a picture that you can see of that. But the man would come into a room, and they would pose by flexing their calf muscles. And as they did this, it was to impress a lady, making the leg. Ladies also did a lot of things. One of the things that was very popular in this period was fan language. It was very hot. They had lots of clothes, and sometimes people didn't bathe as often as they should. They had a thing about the water being dirty, which it was, and so they did not get sick. They just didn't take very many baths. And so they would smell. So both men and women would make perfume, and they would wear lots of it. And the ladies would carry their fan and use the fan to get air moving so that people could smell their perfume. But they could communicate with one another. For example, just a couple of them, if you touched your right cheek with your fan, it meant yes. If you touched your left cheek, it meant no. If you touched your nose with your fan, it meant I don't trust you. And if you opened up your fan and blinked at someone behind it, it would mean I love you. Or you could take the fan and point to your heart to mean I love you. So since a lot of the wealthy people had lovers. Everyone wanted to be married, but since the king had lots of mistresses, then everyone wanted to be like the king. So a lot of people had outside love affairs. And they might come up to someone and their husband would be watching and they would go, no, I will not meet you tonight. I definitely will not meet you tonight behind the barn at 9 o'clock. I love my husband and I hate you. I hate you so much. So that they would send a signal. And that's incorporated in the plays. We see a lot of fan language. We see the making the leg and other things that were very popular in society in that time period. Well, time marches on, and we still don't have actor training. We're still using a system where people will be apprentices, and by being an apprentice, you will learn to act. In the late 1700s and early 1800s, Romanticism becomes the dominant art form, and we see it across the board. The Romantics wanted us to see life as it should be, not as it is. They wanted things to be perfect. They wanted it to be nice, to be good. We see this a lot in their architecture. This is a time period when they built houses with big Greek columns. They thought the ancient Greeks was a time of purity, and so they wanted to reflect back to the ancient Greeks. We see this in the writing and a lot of the paintings. If you look at paintings of people from the 17 and 1800s, a lot of times the person looks prettier or more handsome than they actually were. The idea being we want to see life as we wish it would be, not as it was. Now in theater, there are two types of theater that come up during this period. One is called heroic drama. Heroic drama, unlike tragedy, can have a happy ending. They may not. And also, unlike tragedy, the characters in heroic drama tended to be commoners, not of royal birth. And the plays in heroic drama are a little bigger than life. The characters are a little bigger than life. Now, we see that in a lot of films now. Certainly, if you see Indiana Jones, any of the Indiana Jones films, they are all heroic dramas. It's a heroic figure who is the protagonist, and all the protagonists fight for the good of society, for the good, not for their own personal gains. They may start out that way, but in the end, they do what is right for society. A lot of your superheroes are the same way. So you see it a lot in film today. The other type of theater that was very popular in the late 1700s and early 1800s was melodrama. Now, melodrama is called song drama, and it's called song drama because they played themes for the various characters, and music was played underscoring scenes. So if there's a fight scene, there would be fight music. When the lover came out, we would have a love tune play, and it would play every time they came out. When the villain came out, you might hear dun 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 yum bum bum bum. And that's carried on in film as well. Again, we've talked before about Star Wars. All the characters in Star Wars have themes. Darth Vader comes out, Every time you'll hear dun 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 dun, and then when Luke Skywalker appears, you hear the Star Wars theme playing. So it's still with us. Melodrama is still with us. In melodrama, the stories are bigger than life, and good always wins, and there's always a happy ending. Characters, the hero, in traditional melodrama, the hero always wore white. The villain always wore black. Now, they carried that through in Star Wars. Luke Skywalker always wears white, unless he's in hiding. And Darth Vader, always in black. The Emperor, always in black. And that's done on purpose. It's because Star Wars is a giant melodrama. But the acting in melodrama was bigger than life. It was very large. This is a period where giant gestures were used by the actors. Nothing was subtle, because the characters are not subtle. We have in acting in this period what are called actor managers. Now, the actor managers were often the star of the company. Basically, how it worked was this. If I was liked well enough, I could form my own company, and I would hire all the actors. They would play all the minor roles. I would play all the starring roles. And these actor managers were pretty brilliant. I mean, at any given time, they could do anywhere from 10 to 20 plays. They would play the lead, and they would know all the lines of all those plays, because it was rare that they rehearsed them. Some actor managers actually traveled by themselves, and they would just go from town to town or city to city, and they would act with a local group of actors. And the local actors, again, would play all the small roles, and then the visiting actor manager would play the lead role, whatever that might be. There are some famous actor managers. One of the most famous was a character named Edwin Forrest. Edwin Forrest was an American actor manager. He acted in the 1840s on up through the 1860s. And he was a star. He was also very pro-America. He's famous for what was later referred to as the muscle school of acting. He was built a lot like an NFL linebacker. I mean, he was this tree trunk of a man. He had broad shoulders, and it just went straight down. He had big muscular legs. When he acted, he wore tight pants to show off his muscles, and he would pose and flex his muscles when he acted. To be or not to be, that is the question. And we have accounts in newspapers of women and some men who would faint in the audience when he acted, as he hit his poses, because he was so manly. And he also talked very, very loud. That was one of his trademarks. There's a great story about him and another actor manager. He was from England, and his name was William Charles Macready. Macready was very handsome. He was a great actor in England. And what happened was he was invited to come to the United States, to New York City, and they wanted him to do the Scottish play, to Macbeth. And he agreed. He was paid a large sum of money. Macready shows up in New York. Well, just so happens, across town in a different theater, Edwin Forrest was doing the same play. And he did not like the fact that a English person, one of those Englishers, was being brought in to America to do Shakespeare, because, as we all know, Shakespeare should be done in its traditional American speech, not British. And he let word get out that he was displeased. Well, there were gangs in New York. Maybe you saw the film Gangs in New York. These gangs were a lot of them were very pro-American. They were against people coming into the country, hated immigrants. And some of these gangs, these very pro-American gangs, went to the theater. It was called Astor Place. They went to the Astor Place Theater, and they took up large numbers of the seats when Macready was performing, and when he would come out, they would throw tomatoes and yell things at him when he performed, and of course it would stop the performance. And after trying a couple times, he'd had enough. He told his producers he was going back to England. He no longer could take this, and they begged him, one more performance, please. Come and do one more performance, and we'll make sure that those ruffians don't show up at the theater. And that night, the theater was surrounded with New York policemen. They brought out the National Guard to protect the theater. And when the followers of Forrest found out about this, they showed up, and the followers of Forrest and the followers of Macready met in the streets and did battle. I mean, they actually fought over who was the best actor. I mean, it'd be like today, people going, oh, Johnny Depp is the greatest actor. No, Denzel Washington, Johnny Depp, Denzel Washington. And then they'd go fighting. And people were actually killed. And these were called the Astor Place riots. And they fought on into the night. And there's a story that finally, in the early hours of the morning, the police go to Edwin Forrest's house and they beg him. They say, Mr. Forrest, come out and talk to your supporters. Tell them to go home, to stop this. And Forrest looked at the police and he went, they are great Americans. They are great patriots. And he went back into his home. He refused to talk to them. And the riots went on into the night. And as I said, people were killed. Now, Forrest got some bad press for that, but there were a lot of Americans who loved him for standing up for America against this Englishman. Of course, he had a long and prosperous career as an actor-manager. Another actor-manager that you may want to know is a family. And it started with the father, whose name was Junius Brutus Booth. And Junius Brutus Booth moved to the United States from England, and he traveled by himself around the country. And rather than having a company, he would act with local actors. And there's a great story. I read a diary of an actor who actually worked with him. And he talks about Junius Brutus Booth, and he said they were going to do Julius Caesar. And Booth was supposed to show up the morning before the performance that night for a rehearsal. So they were going to have one rehearsal to divide up the roles and go through the play. Well, that morning, all the local actors showed up, and Junius Brutus Booth did not. So after waiting for a while, they decided who was going to play who, and that they would meet back at the theater that night for the performance. And that night, a half hour before showtime, all the actors were there. Crowds were coming in. The theater was going to be packed. Audiences was just mad to see Junius Brutus Booth. And he was not there. 20 minutes before the show, no Junius Brutus Booth. 15 minutes before the show, no Junius Brutus Booth. They're getting very worried because they can't put an understudy on because people paid money to see Junius Brutus Booth. And audiences in that day and time were very famous for storming the stage if they got mad enough at a production. And so they're afraid for their lives that if Booth doesn't show up, the audience is going to attack them. Well, 5 minutes before the show starts, the stage door opens and in walks Junius Brutus Booth. And he'd had a few, and he walks in, he starts shaking hands with everyone and tells them, let's go do this. And so they go out on stage. the play begins. And it's described just like I'm going to do what the book describes Booth. He walked out into his position. He stood, he posed. What play are we doing? And they told him. He poses again. And who am I? And they told him. He poses again, and then he starts the play and did not miss a line. He played Brutus, went through the whole play, got standing ovations, and was perfect. Not unusual for the actors of that time period. Now, he had two famous sons. One infamous, and you probably have heard of him, and it's John Wilkes Booth, who assassinated Abraham Lincoln. The other was also an actor, and a very famous actor, and he even today has a theater named after him, and his name was Edwin Booth. Edwin Booth was a Shakespearean actor. He ended up becoming, in the late 1800s, the greatest American actor of that time. He's amazing to read about because he actually got into trouble once because he really cried on stage. He was doing Hamlet, and when he was talking about Ophelia, real tears ran down his face as he performed, and somebody came up to him afterwards and said, "What's wrong with you? You were too real out there tonight." But he is the beginning of what's going to become realistic acting.